So I'm here today to kind of talk to you about just the history of these big, forest pest outbreaks we've had in North America. And, the reason why I started to research this or put this study together is, just about the time I hit grad school, emerald ash borer was a brand new thing in this country. It was probably all of us on the call today know about that or have heard about that particular pest. But to me, based on what I learned in college, it's like, here we go again. It's yet another one of these species eliminating pests that has come from another continent and has really impacted our continent. So I just got interested in, what are the lessons learned? What are some of the differences between these pathogens or insects that have taken out parts of our forest here in North America? And so that's kind of the inspiration behind this presentation. Here's a little bit of an outline of what we'll talk about today, where I'm just going to talk about, several of the historic forest pests, how they spread, what does that mean, how's that impacted us, and talk about maybe some of the solutions folks have looked at. But also at the end of the presentation today, I'll cover a few of the newer ones. What could be some of the next, species eliminating pests that invade our continent. And then finally, we'll just end with, just a brief slide on some lessons learned. What should we think about for the future as we take in all this information? So I'm going to start today with a species that was pretty popular across North America, across the eastern part of North America, the American chestnut. And, in my experience as a forester, I haven't dealt with this plant much. It was eliminated by a pathogen we'll talk about here. But safe to say it was a really abundant tree around 1900, where they've estimated that about 1 in 4 trees across its natural range were chestnuts. And it was a really important plant, both ecologically. It supported a lot of species, a lot of biota, and commercially. It was late flowering, so there wasn't it didn't have its flowers killed by frost very often. A reliable nut producer, and just made some excellent quality lumber. We can still find some of this lumber in buildings and other places today. So a few more details about the plant. If you haven't seen a chestnut in the wild, a lot of us haven't. Pretty tall tree with a fast growth rate. So, to have a tree that has really dense, high quality wood fiber and a fast growth rate, that's something that's really important. You can see its leaves here that are kind of, toothed, kind of oblong leaves. Really don't look like a whole lot of other trees we have, maybe chestnut oak or chinkapin oak, but its flowering display was, one that you couldn't miss. In about June, all across its range that you would see those flowers that then developed into, the spiky husks you see there on the limbs. So anyway, just a noteworthy plant. And here's kind of what we've estimated as its natural range to have been. And you can see it really covers, a lot of the eastern US, and quite a range there north to south. So again, it was an important, culturally important, keystone species to a lot of other species throughout its range. But you can see its wood had a lot of uses, used for everything from, furniture to lumber to just all sorts of things. The nuts were used by, of course, wildlife, livestock, and even humans. It was harvested and sold widely, that nut crop every year. So, in researching this, I read there's a lot of neat and interesting history, if you like the human history side of all this. And, one of those neat stories I uncovered was that a lot of times, at chestnut harvest time, these nuts were actually used as currency in some of the small towns where they were traded. And it was just, again, just kind of illustrates, the really important aspect that this nut provided to the eastern US. But at a certain point, a pathogen from Southeast Asia was introduced in the US. And, we refer to it as chestnut blight is the disease, if you haven't heard of it. And, basically it resulted in, on chestnuts anyway, stem girdling cankers that would kill the tissue. So over time, in fairly rapid succession, an infected tree would have those girdling cankers just slowly kill the canopy and the entire plant. Where you can see here, I've listed some of the other susceptible species, some of which would develop stem cankers, but some of which simply housed the infection and served as kind of an infection source that, kind of spread it to chestnuts and helped to spread it across its range. So this pathogen was first detected in 1904 at the Bronx Zoo, and we think it was imported on infected plants from Asia. How does it spread is usually a question that we want to answer. And really, we think a lot of the spread from chestnut blight was just from natural spread. So, from either wind-blown ascospores or birds could carry, the asexual form of reproduction for this fungus. And so between birds and wind carrying this, that's how we think it really started to spread and really, encompass like this entire range that I really like how this map kind of shows, over just, a 50-year period there, it really marched down the entire range of the American chestnut. And, we think by 1950, American chestnut was functionally extinct from the ecosystem. That doesn't mean the plant doesn't exist, but it means as far as performing those ecosystem benefits that chestnut would provide, that was pretty much eliminated by 1950. So that's a pretty short time to take a key piece of this biology out of that ecosystem. So when we look at blight susceptibility by different species, our American chestnut highly susceptible. That our chestnut evolved on a different continent than this pathogen and really just had no coevolutionary history, no resistance to it. European chestnut, less susceptible to blight, but still was ravaged by this disease. But hypovirulence has built some resistance. I'll talk about that in a minute. It was a way that some natural resistance actually happened in European chestnut that allowed it to recover. Whereas Chinese chestnut, evolved on the same continent as this pathogen, had resistance to the chestnut blight. It evolved the ability to have some natural defenses and to ward off chestnut blight in its native ecosystem. So what's American chestnut look like today? Well, there's blight resistant root systems that produce shoots and send up, I mentioned on one of the slides, it was the tree coppices really well, meaning that we can cut it off at the base and it sends sprouts up and grows a new tree. So some of those coppice trunks or those root systems that still exist that haven't been infected can send up shoots that once they get large enough, they become infected and they die back. There's records of some isolated, more Western trees that exist, and you can kind of find, a random chestnut that exists in one place or another from time to time. But what we've seen is quite a bit of work, because this has been, well over 100 years that this pathogen's been established on our continent with some different breeding. And that's what I want to cover next, is some of the solutions that we've looked at over the years, which, in the early phases of this, from the 20s to the 60s, we focused on crossbreeding. So we took, those Asian resistant species and crossbred that with the American chestnut to try and get some of that blight resistance. And, although we did get pretty good blight resistance in those crossbred species, they just weren't competitive in a forest setting. So we're not able to, one of the goals of trying to restore chestnut is to restore it ecologically. So it could be restored across its range, it could compete in nature, it could provide that valuable asset to the ecosystem that it was before, but we found those hybrids really weren't, competitive in a forested setting. Where in the 80s, we started to look at what's called back crossing, where we took, we created this hybrid, some of these hybrids, and we back crossed them then again with American chestnut, with the idea that we're, kind of saving some of those, Chinese genes for resistance, but we're diluting them with a lot more American genes as we back cross those species, those plants. And the idea is just that we could create something that, functioned in nature here. So hypovirulence is a really interesting instance of some natural resistance that's developed. And in this case, it's a virus that affects this pathogen, the fungal pathogen that's responsible for chestnut blight, and weakens it. And so it's naturally occurred. It's also we've introduced it to plants, but it naturally has kind of allowed the European chestnut to slowly recover. Here in the US, there's actually some reports of some success of this naturally occurring virus that has in Michigan, in the Lower Peninsula of Michigan, there's been some examples. But we haven't seen success in restoring it at an ecosystem level. While there's a little bit of success out in nature in Michigan, it hasn't translated to other places. But interestingly, arborists can use that virus to inject certain areas of the plant and can show some success, but it's just not practical to control that over a whole tree, or really it's not a recommended treatment necessarily, but just super interesting instance where a virus then is kind of impacting this fungus. But what's even interested me more in all this is I've looked into, what are some of the possible solutions, is the use of biotechnology or genetic modification of chestnut trees. So oxalate oxidase is an enzyme that helps to stop the harmful effects of oxalic acid, which is what this pathogen produces, that breaks down tree tissue and allows that canker to be so bad. And so that is a naturally occurring gene in wheat plants, and in a lot of other things, wheat, bananas, strawberries, like a lot of things we eat, we can see this gene within, and a lot of things in nature, we can also observe this gene. So it's been added to chestnut trees to get some resistance. So, and it's worked. There's living growing chestnuts that have been affected with this, that have had this gene added, that are showing excellent resistance. So as I last checked, and this may be year or so old, it was currently waiting USDA approval for this plant to be released to the rest of us, or to at least to start experimenting in the wild a little bit more with it. So that may be something on the horizon for chestnut, and that offers yet another possibility for restoring it across its range. So now let's move to another species, the American elm. And probably a lot of us have experienced American elms. Here's a picture from the entrance to the Morton Arboretum. And whenever I think of an American elm, I mean, that is the plant that I picture this large shade tree with a really vase-shaped spreading habit, just kind of like that perfect shade tree form. And so because it was such a resilient plant, it could grow across just a wide range of conditions, it could handle urban soils, it became one of the preferred shade trees in the 19th century in this country. And you could find entire cities that were just lined with elm trees. And so extensively planted, ahead of a pathogen attacking this plant. And here's kind of the natural range of elm, where you can see it's much wider than chestnut. It's really extensive. It kind of illustrates just all the different types of locations of the landscape it can inhabit, just the versatility of the plant. But Dutch elm disease is the pathogen here that is actually a couple different fungal pathogens that we introduced inadvertently. We believe it originated in Asia, but it's spread by bark beetles. So in this case, we have a beetle that's taking this fungal pathogen and infecting each individual tree with that over time. So that's how this pathogen has spread, is through that beetle flying tree to tree and taking it with it. Where I think in the case of American elm, with it being such a widely used urban tree and just so prevalent in the landscape and close to so many humans, it was also the spread of firewood that helped to kind of move this pathogen around. We as humans are really good at moving firewood and moving the pathogens right along with it. So here's kind of a map that just shows, it was initially introduced in around 1930. This 1933 infection in New York is kind of the one that I think we talk about a lot, but actually was introduced a little sooner in Cleveland, Ohio, on European elm logs that came in and brought the beetle harboring this fungus to our shores. And you can see in pretty short order, in just about 50 years, remember that was about what it took for chestnut blight to kind of spread across the natural range of the chestnut. It reached the West Coast and pretty much had spread across the entire country. So really not that long of a time frame when we think about the time it's taken for forests to form on this continent and plants to evolve and everything else. That's pretty short order compared to some of the other things that have had to happen. So what are the susceptible species? Well, a lot of our elms here in North America, with American elm kind of topping the list, are susceptible. European elms are susceptible as well. But if you look again, the Asian species are resistant to this pathogen. And again, it's because of that coevolutionary history. These plants and insects evolved together and have, that one wouldn't exist without the other if they hadn't co-evolved in Asia. So what's American elm look like today? It exists in forests as understory trees. They have some resistance when they're younger, so you can find little elm trees around a lot. They're actually, elms can pretty quickly, pretty young, relatively young in their life, produce seeds. So a lot of these younger elms are able to grow, produce seed, and before Dutch elm disease can kill them, they're able to reproduce. So that's kind of kept, this elm population out there that's just smaller trees, that's very much shrunk from its original range. So absolutely nothing like its original range. We would consider it functionally extinct from the ecosystem. There's rare mature specimens in urban areas. I know a few right here in Champaign-Urbana. I know of some in Southern Illinois that for one reason or another, a particular plant has some resistance or doesn't attract the beetles or doesn't develop the infection from the fungus or have the same effects. So you can find these random, like in the picture here from Missouri, a random large elm tree that's out there. But mostly what we've looked at is breeding with elm trees to kind of get some resistance and try and look at a solution to this particular problem. So, some of so anyway, plant breeders have combined, Asian elms with our American species and produced some pretty good resistance, to Dutch elm disease. But really, they're not a great replacement from an ornamental standpoint. If we're talking about this in terms of an urban tree, a lot of those hybrid Asian elms have, they're smaller at maturity, and they just have a different look and feel than, the elms that, like the picture from the Morton Arboretum that I shared a little bit earlier. But they do have good resistance. So we were able to achieve resistance with the hybrids, just not quite the same ornamental value from this plant, and definitely not the same. They wouldn't behave in the ecosystem the same. We wouldn't be able to restore elm across its range with these hybrids. Where also we've developed disease-resistant cultivars. So if you don't know the difference between a hybrid and a cultivar, a hybrid is where we've combined two different species. We've crossbred those species to, try to find some desirable traits in that hybrid. But a cultivar is, the same species. So American elm plants that have shown resistance, we've tried to copy those genetics in a cultivar. So it's an American elm's, individual plant that shows some resistance that then we can copy through cuttings. We can, we wouldn't want to just take seeds from that plant because that's open to pollination and, some genetic variability. We want to actually copy that with a cutting or another method of propagation that just makes an exact copy. And so through that, we've got some pretty good Dutch elm disease resistant in some of the examples I've listed here as some of these cultivars. So that's yet another way we've looked to kind of address this. So currently, that's kind of the best. It's kind of the best solution we found to the problem, but again, it's not a solution that restores elm across its natural range that really replaces that ecosystem function that was lost when it was eliminated. And so now that brings us to a discussion of our kind of current, the current chestnut blight or Dutch elm disease, the emerald ash borer. And so it was introduced in 2002, and by 2006 it had reached Illinois. And here you can see the map from 2021 that it's really spread quite, across a lot of our, I don't have a map of our native elms, native range, but across the or ashes, across our native ashes range, it's really spread rapidly. So it really is kind of occupying most of that space right now. So how does this pathogen or this insect kill trees? Well, unlike some of the other two where there was a fungal pathogen involved, this insect feeds on the xylem and phloem of the plant. So essentially it eats the conductive tissue away and essentially kind of girdles the tree. So it's not this pathogenic fungus that's spreading throughout the plant and causing, mortality. It's actually the insect feeding on the plant that, the physical act of feeding that is actually what's killing these trees. So how do you identify emerald ash borer? We used to talk a lot in the early stages when it was here about the D-shaped exit hole, and you need to use that to identify it. I'd say nowadays across most all of Illinois, it's like anytime an ash tree starts to look sick, you can kind of assume emerald ash borer is probably at play. And, just a side note, by the time you're really noticing a lot of symptoms of emerald ash borer, like half the, good section of the canopy is dead, the time for treatment in an urban setting is gone. So it's too bad because we don't have a way to really early detect, that infection. So if you do have, there are treatments available for emerald ash borer that are effective. So if you have that prized ash in the middle of your front yard that you just want to save, now's the time to do that if it's still looking good. So by the time, as an arborist, I was called a lot. By the time the plant already looked bad and it's just too far along, those, too much of that xylem and phloem has been consumed by that point, that our control measures aren't effective. So anyway, identification, at this point in time in Illinois, it's an ash tree that's starting to show decline, but we also see heavy woodpecker damage. So you see, I showed the slide right here of some woodpecker damage. That's called blonding of the bark, and that's from woodpeckers that are after that larva. That's what they're trying to eat, is the immature caterpillars that are feeding in the inside of the ash tree. They're trying to get at that and eat them. So we do see increased woodpecker damage and activity where there's an active emerald ash borer infection. So how's it spread? There's been some research that has shown different rates of natural dispersal. So they're from the same researchers showed a difference in one study of just about 800 meters a year to about 9 kilometers a year of just what we think is maybe the estimated natural dispersal. Some data suggests a greater rate, but really what we've seen with this pathogen is it's the movement of firewood that has spread it so rapidly. And some of the compounding factor with that is just that this and some of these other pathogens just kill trees so rapidly. There's just where there's an active infection going on, there's all kinds of dead ash trees that need to be cut up. It's great reusing it as firewood, but unfortunately that firewood gets moved around. So we've actually put some different, actually regulatory measures in place for emerald ash borer, because we've learned from past pathogens that we don't want to increase that rate of spread any. So how's that kind of played out in Illinois? It first came to Illinois in June 2006. And we started, and even ahead of that, there was a state and federal quarantine in place for infected counties. So we'd say if your county has, at one point in time, we said if your county has a known infection, you don't need to be, no one can transport firewood beyond your county line. And so that the federal quarantine would look at state lines and limit that transportation or movement of firewood or plant materials, just anything that can harbor this pest across state lines. But in 2015, we saw, more infections, and we saw our total reach about 60 counties. So at that point, our State Department of Agriculture lifted the quarantines at the county level inside the state. And the point behind that is just that it's so present in Illinois that the quarantines just weren't doing much to stop the spread. So I believe currently there's still federal quarantines in place where we're trying to stop the spread across state lines, but in Illinois we don't have any more of these county quarantines. So that's just kind of an interesting lessons learned type thing from this, that our Department of Ag was quick to act and put these in place, and that was really the best defensive mechanism we had at the time. So this is just kind of counties confirmed by year. And it just illustrates the spread. It's coming from north to south, essentially, because our infection point initially was Chicago, again, coming from Detroit originally. So what's the future for ash? Well, it will become functionally extinct throughout its range. That's happening as we speak. That's happening in forests around us right now. A big question right now is, will there be some natural resistance that emerges? So, as a forester in Southern Illinois, as this was, folks saw this coming, a question I had from a lot of landowners was, should I get out there and get every ash tree out of the woods? And, that's probably not a bad idea when you're thinking about your economic investment, but, we've seen from other past pathogens is that if we remove all those plants ahead of the infection, we may be removing some of that natural resistance and just the natural genetics of a particular individual among the species. So, so that's a question. Will we have some natural resistance emerge? So I think that's an argument to not harvest all of our ash out of our woodlands. It's important to have some of those around so we can see if there's an individual that could show some resistance. A question in the past has been, is blue ash resistant? I don't know that I've necessarily read research that confirms this or unconfirms it, but from what I've understood from other foresters that have looked at this is that blue ash is just maybe not the preferred species, where emerald ash borer still is impacting that plant once all the other ash species, once green and white ash are gone, then blue ash is possibly the next one. It's just not the preferred species. So the last question here is, will biological control work? So this is a really interesting instance where we have introduced some wasps that work to control emerald ash borer. So since about 2007, we've been releasing those across the range, the emerald ash borer range, and we're trying to potentially stabilize or stop the spread of emerald ash borer. So here's a map of wasp release in 2018 and 2019, kind of at that leading edge, and what it's showing us is yellow are the counties where they've been released, and then those little dots are counties where they've trapped those wasps. So that means that there's an active population breeding and active in that area, and so they've been able to stick around. So that's important. If we just release these wasps, but they can't stick around, are they really going to do much to control this? So this is just a comparison of kind of the 2020 range versus the 2019 biological control map, and you can see they're trying to kind of disperse that across the leading edge of this to hopefully slow the spread. So what kind of resistance do we see? Well, our native ash trees, some of those smaller, younger trees are showing some natural resistance, but only to a certain extent. We've actually, one interesting aspect of this is we definitely have observed, and it's documented in the research, that woodpecker populations are on the upswing in areas where emerald ash borer comes in, just like you would expect in nature. There's more food, their population expands. And in combination with these parasitic wasps at that leading edge of the emerald ash borer infection, we think we're seeing kind of a combination of control or slowing of the spread that has happened because native woodpeckers and these parasitic wasps are really heavily feeding on the emerald ash borer. So here's just a slide that kind of shows, the 4 main species that have been introduced, and just a little bit about them, that some of them are egg parasitoids, meaning they deposit something in the egg that kills doesn't allow the egg to hatch typically, where some of them actually infect the larva. So where you can see, they infect the larva and kill the insect that way. So it's a couple different ways they react, and you can see some of the relative kind of percentages of control we've seen from the research. If you're interested in learning more about this, this is a really great report that I've read online. It's free for download if you look it up. And it really goes through, why they've implemented it, what they're looking at, what are some of the standards for success that they're trying to achieve. It just has a lot of really great info, just all the details about this. So a nice report there. And I'm listing the 2019 report. There may be something actually newer out there that you could check out. So now we've kind of covered some of our historic pests. Let's talk about some of the newer things on the horizon. So the first of which I'd like to talk about is laurel blight. And if you haven't heard of this one, it's present across a lot of the southern and eastern U.S. It's pretty present, in warmer climates from here, essentially, some of the warmer climatic zones. But it's again a combination of this insect pest, the ambrosia beetle, combined with this, really a fungal pathogen that we haven't entirely classified or identified yet. So these beetles are spreading that pathogen amongst susceptible plants. So what are some of the species affected? The red bay tree is really one of the biggest across its natural range across the southern U.S. Georgia, Florida, through that range, some of the Gulf states is where we've really seen it hit hard, but others in the laurel family. So in Illinois, what that translates to us are sassafras and spicebush are 2 species that this pathogen will eventually impact in our state when it gets here. So far we haven't detected it yet, but you can see this range map shows that we have some infections creeping up into Kentucky. And I'm guessing this map's even a little bit out of date for what's been reported. It's been a little while since I've kind of tuned into the latest maps or the latest reports on this, but this is one of those pathogens that we can expect to probably see in Illinois sometime soon. And while it doesn't impact one of our major timber species necessarily, sassafras isn't a super sought after timber species. It's part of the ecology of our forests, and we don't know, we probably can't even imagine what we might be missing if it gets eliminated. Spice bush, just an understory shrub, shade tolerant. Gosh, one of my favorite shade tolerant shrubs to add to the landscape. I've planted quite a few over the years. What I really valued from spice bush as a forester is it could almost compete in spots where it really got going. It could almost compete with some of our invasive shrubs like bush honeysuckle that are shade tolerant. So there's areas where I've seen people actually misidentify spice bush for honeysuckle just because it was a shrub that was everywhere and filling the understory. So it provides an important niche in the understory. There's a few, specific insects that are, it's a host to. So it would be an important loss, ecologically as well, if it gets impacted with laurel wilt. Next one I'd like to discuss is sudden oak death. And we actually had a scare here recently in Illinois that this pathogen could have came here. So it was first detected in the 1990s in California. And if you've looked at any of the information from California about this, I mean, it is doom and gloom. There is, it's wiped in, stands of coastal oaks have just been wiped out across California by this pathogen. It's caused by, fungal pathogen P. ramorum. And so that pathogen actually, interestingly, can take two different forms. One is ramorum blight, which is just a foliar disease in many species. And the other is sudden oak death, where, it's fatal to oak species. And in that form of infection, again, the same pathogen, it forms stem girdling cankers is how it's actually killing those plants and is really devastating. So here's just another slide on that, really stem girdling cankers that cause rapid death are, the result. And, it's spread by spores or from infected plants. So it's, we aren't necessarily pointing at humans moving firewood as the main source of this, but we're talking about, the spread from, across infected plants. So to go back a slide here, if we're talking about a plant that has ramorum blight, this foliar form of the disease, we may not actually see death of the plant. It may not look great. It may suffer from, just typical signs and symptoms of a fungal leaf infection, but it's not dying from it. So that individual plant that's infected serves as just this source of infection for the rest of the population. So that's really kind of the danger with this pathogen, is that it infects, over 100 species as ramorum blight, where, again, sudden oak death, that when we call it that, that's just our oak species that it's limited to. So that's just kind of an important thing to understand about this, because in 2019, we had an outbreak, where you see some of the headlines saying sudden oak death. Essentially what was found was ramorum blight in this case. So that foliar version of this pathogen was found on rhododendrons and lilacs, which both, are obviously susceptible to the disease. And that was eventually linked to some infected plant material from Oklahoma that arrived at a lot of different big box stores across the Midwest. So all over the place, this plant material that was sent out and found to be infected was recalled. And so there was, a quick push by our State Department of Agriculture to find these plants, to destroy them, to take them out of the population. And so we think, fingers crossed here, we think that was entirely contained, and really due to, I think it's a great nod to the nursery industry, in that we tracked this plant material and we were able to find out where these plants had came from, where they were going, and we were able to really try and mitigate this pretty quickly. So if you're following the news that summer, that, it was in the headlines quite a bit. So anyway, that's kind of a lesson learned, that, even through infected plant material, we can get what's, you see pictured here is just a leaf infection or, a twig infection that could spread, into our native oak stands and really take down, oak species as a whole across our ecosystem. So this is one that we really need to look for and watch for, and, be cognizant about. Where I know I got in my extension office a lot of calls about this back in 2019 when this happened. And, really our recommendation was that, if you recently planted a rhododendron, I think maybe some azaleas were in on this too. A rhododendron, azalea, or lilac, if you planted it this year, that's the plant you should watch. And then we could also say, here's some of the locations they were sold at. But a lot of calls just, about lilacs with, an existing lilac in their yard that had an infection. And that wasn't what we were looking for. It was, kind of the newly planted stuff and watching that for these infections. And then, the hope was we could stop it before it spread across the communities, across the oak community. So, what are the big lessons we've learned here? I think with emerald ash borer and the others, we've learned to not move firewood. That's a major way that we as humans, increase the rate of spread rapidly. Just like I mentioned with ash trees, don't necessarily cut down every tree of that species. We could lose some resistant genetics in the removal of that species if humans start to do that. So it may be worth keeping some of those around. As across, across the conversation amongst forestry professionals, folks that are active in urban forestry, planting a diversity of species is really important. And, as a forestry professional, I would look at in any tree planting, adding a diversity of species first, just because certain species might not be perfectly suited to the site and you get better survival rate. But when we look at urban forests, they really have historically not had a lot of diversity. And I think most urban foresters are planning for diversity, and we're starting to see a change in that trend. But if you looked at, at the time Dutch elm disease hit, what was the percentage of the urban canopy that was elm trees? It was a high percentage across a lot of communities. And so we're seeing a change in that, but that's a big lesson learned, is adding diversity is key. The last 2 points here, a lot of these pathogens are going to come from other continents, from other places where our natives did not have that coevolutionary history. So international plant material coming in as a vector, with the ever-globalizing society we have right now and all the rapid transportation of materials around the planet, we can expect to see future outbreaks. So I hate to have too much doom and gloom at this presentation, but it's something that all of us as folks that are in tune with trees, that are in tune with plants out in nature, we need to be watching for these things and asking questions and trying to understand why each and every plant is sick, so we can catch the next, possible big infection before it happens. So with that, I think we have a little time for questions. I've posted kind of my contact information here, so feel free to reach out to me on this topic or any tree topics. I talk to a lot of folks every year with a variety of tree questions. You can email me. I write a weekly blog called The Garden Scoop, where I talk about a lot of different topics, not just forestry and trees. You'll see a lot of trees discussed in my blog, but also native plants is an area I'm interested in. Vegetable production is something I kind of do as a hobby and talk about in there too. So check it out if you're interested.